Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 3, Advanced Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operations. This is Module 3, Contract Administration, and it's Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand how to achieve competitive pricing and the role of negotiation in procurement. So we're going to look at the comparisons of ways to obtain quotes on price, the role of the commercial negotiation in the workplace, and the approaches to negotiation. So let's start with a definition. What do we mean by a competitive price? A word often misused by procurement because we often think it's not low enough, and not low enough means not competitive, but that's not true. A competitive price is a price that is set with reference to what other people are supplying the same or similar items or services for and what they're charging them for. So essentially, a competitive price is determined by comparing your price with your competitors. Now, that could be in line with, below, or above. If it's in line with the competitor's rate, then essentially it's very similar. If it's below, competitor might be doing that to attract new customers or working with a strategy known as loss leader, or because they're well established, which means they haven't got a lot of overheads. It could also mean that they're offering a lower quality product, so do be careful. It could be above the competitor rate to highlight a quality difference or because they have higher costs. So how do we know whether it's competitive? There are some methods we can use to obtain competitive prices, including monitoring them, obtaining quotes, and comparing to historical prices. But do beware of the 3 quotes problem. It's not always enough to get 3 quotes, because if you get one in that's below, above, and in line, how will you know which one's competitive? You're probably going to need at least 4 or 5 to see a cluster of rates that are sort of similar. Now, the rate offered is going to depend on a number of things. So firstly, the timing. Secondly, the urgency. Third, the specification. Fourth, the exchange rate. And 5, the quantity ordered. So for example, if you're booking a train or a flight ticket, prices are cheaper if you book in advance, and they increase closer to the travel time. Sometimes you get a discount for buying 2 and getting 1 free. Or bundling, like you do on Amazon. Cheaper prices are offered if you're ordering more than one product. Or a price for a new car will depend on the additional features. But I also think it depends on the internal processes of your business. If you're the sort of business that takes a long time to pay your suppliers or to raise orders and you want everything last minute, then they're going to charge you handsomely for that. But they'll reserve their better prices for the customers that have got a better track record. And as you'll remember from previous modules, the Porter's 5 forces model outlines how buyers should consider the market, and that's in order to understand their position within it. The prices you achieve will depend on the extent to the competition that's going on in the market. So bluntly, on the left-hand side where you've got the power of the buyers and at the top where you've got threat of new entrants, there is a lot of competition in those markets. So it naturally lends itself to being able to achieve competitive prices. But at the bottom and on the right, where you've got the threat of substitutes and the power of suppliers, you've either got a monopoly or an oligopoly situation here, which means the supplier to some extent can exert maximum or definitely high levels of power. But in addition, you're going to need to understand the nature of your specification, think about volumes, consider doing some requests for information just to find out if what you're asking for is bespoke or whether it can be done by a number of suppliers. And try and seek as many quotes as possible or issue a tender. To achieve competitive prices, procurement staff should monitor price movements in the goods and services they're responsible for. Movements in the average market rates are reported by general trade and industry press, and it's influenced by trends, supply and demand, cost of supply, and regulations. You can look at previous spot purchases prices versus the term prices paid by your organisation. But if you are doing that, do double check the sort of months that you achieve better prices. It may be that you can get a better price January, February and March than you can the rest of the year. You can check the catalogue prices that are published by suppliers and also publish tender results in the public sector. And of course, you can always obtain quotations. Now, when the quotes come back, you are going to need to assess the quotes. And you do that by going through a number of steps. Firstly, compare the new with the old. Do check to see if there's anything different, whether the price has gone up or the price has gone down or the price has stayed the same. Check 2 would be to look at the market movements for the same period. Has there been any inflation or deflation in that period? Then check the spec. Your spec might be out of date. Maybe something has changed. There's innovation that you could benefit from. Check the quantity and contract length. Has there been a previous discount or are you getting a discount now because you're buying more? Review the supply market using the Porter's Forces model and your position in the buyer's market. Now, negotiations occur between two parties that want to reach an agreement, and it may require a level of compromise. A successful negotiation will depend on the experience of the parties negotiating, as well as any preparation that's been undertaken. And there are two main approaches to commercial negotiation. The one on the left-hand side is a collaborative win-win integrative approach based on the assumption that it's possible for both parties to make gains. Gaining by one party does not mean losing for the other. But on the right-hand side, you've got the distributive negotiation style, which works on a win-lose approach. If one party makes a gain, the other one loses. So, for example, when negotiating on price, a purchaser wants to lower the rate, the supplier will make less profit. So it becomes a bit of a tug of war. Collaborative negotiation is about increasing the size of the pie so everybody can benefit from it. Distributive is more about sharing out the slices of the pie. Now, it's not to say that you always go down the collaborative route. You need to consider what's more important to you, the ongoing relationship with that supplier or the outcome. If the outcome and the relationship is important, then collaborative is the way forward. But if the outcome is more important than the relationship, then a distributive approach would be more relevant. But in terms of negotiations in general, the advantages to doing this, of course, is that it can be quicker than other sourcing routes where you're issuing tenders and quotes. It does allow you to exchange information as well, which means as time goes on, as you're going through the negotiation, you can refine the specification through the dialogue, whereas traditionally with quotes and tenders, you need to be quite clear about your specification in advance. Allows gain from the market position, and the suppliers may very well improve on their original quote. But another advantage to this is actually what you do is capture market insights that you perhaps didn't have knowledge of previously. The downside, though, is it can take longer if there are lots of issues to discuss, and it could potentially damage an ongoing relationship if the supplier feels that they're always losing. It does tend to advantage the experience. The more experienced you are, the better you are. And it can be a breach of public sector regulations for public procurement. There is a procedure known as competitive procedure with negotiation, and it's the only time that you're allowed to negotiate, but there's regulations around it, so do be careful. And if a negotiation cannot be successfully concluded, there are some alternatives known as a BATNA or BATNA, which stands for a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. But what you need to aim to look for is something called the zone of possible agreement, the ZOPA. This is where a deal can be made, but if you don't have any crossover between your wants and the supplier's wants, then there is no room for negotiation. Now, disputes or conflicts within the sourcing process can arise as a result of lack of clarity. And it can be because of expectations or errors in documents or changes in personnel, and that could result in information just not being retained. So if you look through the key stages in the sourcing process on the screen, conflict and negotiation could happen at any of these stages, such as when we're looking at the specification, it could be because of lack of clarity. Or targets, the period of measurement, is it monthly, quarterly, is it annually? The schedules could be based on days, but does it mean calendar days? Does it mean working days? And the liability share, where does the fault lie at different stages? Is it after the delivery's been made that it changes? When the quote's been accepted? And clearly all of this can be avoided by carefully drafting contracts and specifications. And you need to make sure you've got discussions with everyone to ensure we all have a common understanding. So looking back at stakeholders, so we could negotiate with any of our stakeholders, whether that be internally or externally. They are essentially a group of individuals or companies that are affected by or benefiting from what your organisation does. And they can play a role directly or indirectly in the negotiations between a buyer and supplier. So internally, marketing might have a view of what they think the customer wants. You've got sales, saying what they've committed to the customer. Production might have a view on the materials that you need to use. Finance might have a fixed budget, so on and so forth. Essentially, these people can play a role in the negotiation. As with the externals, you've got the customers, consumers, communities, other groups, government and suppliers. So again, there could be something the government say that is an absolute deal breaker. You can't deviate from that. Now, your board and directors are ultimate decision makers. Your commissioning department might have strong views on the specification and may have a preferred supplier. Staff, workers and end users might inform the specification. And the general public may just have concerns about the environment or the social impacts. So once you've got your stakeholders in place, you need to then determine the level of influence each stakeholder has. And that's determined by the level of power and interest coming from the Mendelow's matrix. This is a 2x2 grid, and it can be used to plot stakeholders according to the level of interest and power to determine those whose views you need to prioritise. So high is high power, high interest. These are your key players, manage them closely. High power, low interest, keep satisfied. But also high interest, low power, you need to keep them informed. But minimal effort is needed for those that sit with low power and low interest. So moving on to key terms now. Just going to look at the difference between sort of price and cost and what we mean by break even. So price is the amount paid by a purchaser for goods and services. And that could be made up from fixed and variable cost, direct and indirect. Cost is the total amount that a supplier has to spend in order to provide the goods and services. So that's going to include your direct labour and materials, logistics and indirect costs, which are also known as overheads. Costs can be fixed and variable if you look at the slide on the left, diagram on the left of the slide. Fixed costs remain the same regardless of the quantities purchased and produced, but as you can see from the variable cost, it can be as low as zero if we don't produce anything, all the way up to the maximum cost. And the break-even point is when the price paid for the goods and services matches the cost of providing it. The supplier is not making a profit or a loss unless they make through the break-even point. And when talking about profit margins, it's really important to know whether you're discussing markup or margin. The margin percentage will always be lower than the markup, but they deliver the same cash value profit. Markup is used to express the difference between the cost of the goods and the selling price. It's usually expressed as a percentage. Margin is profit in relation to the selling price, and it might be expressed as a total or as a percentage. So essentially, markup looks at the difference between the profits that you've made and the cost. Margin looks at the profit you've made versus the selling price. So it's a percentage of cost or a percentage of selling price. And you can see an example on the screen now that shows you the difference using exactly the same figures. The markup will be 25%, but the margin will be 20%. The purchaser's job is to ensure that the quality requirements are laid out in the specification and that they're met, not just getting the cheapest price possible, which could risk the quality. But the other aspects that could be discussed during a negotiation include things like delivery times or frequency, the minimum order quantities or the volumes, length and terms of the warranties, the longer the better, the call-out response time for repairs to equipment, the shorter the better, any additional user support and training, and assistance with relocating older equipment if upgrades are being phased in. And there are a number of ways to measure the success of a negotiation. Firstly, you can obviously consider the price reduction that you've achieved, but also the cost of all of your time spent negotiating and preparing for that negotiation. Something called opportunity cost, which is the what you would have lost if those people hadn't worked on other things. So you could spend an enormous amount of time trying to negotiate 5% in one area when that time could have been spent elsewhere getting 10%. And you can review the intended outcome against the actual outcome. But for this one, it doesn't really matter how much you reduce your cost by. If the budget, if it's still over budget, basically, that's what I'm trying to say. In the balanced scorecard approach, you can also consider the cost reduction or price reduction that you've obtained. But you can also look at things like the number of areas that are open for discussion. How many settled in your favour? How many settled in the favour of the supplier? And maybe how many you got mutual benefit from if you're going down the collaborative route. Whether the core source of conflict was resolved, if your market insight has improved, but also if your negotiator skills have also improved. And then let's consider some reasons why sort of negotiations fail. Primarily it's because of lack of planning. You haven't thought about what you want to achieve. You haven't thought about whether or not you're in a stronger position than the supplier and what you could concede and trade with. It may also be that you don't have the knowledge or the best offer's already been received and there's literally no room for any manoeuvre. You have no leverage to offer them back. And another really important reason that happens quite a lot is having the lack of time. You're in a rush, so supplier knows you're in a rush and will price accordingly. But if you have time on your hands, then you can definitely get a better outcome from negotiation. And that's the end of learning outcome 2. Thank you for watching.